May 31st, 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood district, nicknamed Black Wall Street, is the wealthiest black community in America. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, mansions, theaters, a thriving economy built by formerly enslaved people and their children. In 18 hours, it will all be gone. This isn't a story about a race riot. Those are the words white newspapers used for a century to hide the truth. This is a story about a massacre, about a pogrom, about domestic terrorism carried out by thousands of white Tulsans, including police and government officials. Over 300 black residents will be murdered. 1,256 homes will be burned. 35 city blocks completely destroyed. Airplanes will drop firebombs from the sky. Machine guns will fire into crowds. And it will all start with a lie. A lie about a 19-year-old black man and a 17-year-old white woman in an elevator. By June 1st, the wealthiest black neighborhood in America is reduced to ashes. $30 million in black wealth vanished. Survivors are marched through streets at gunpoint. Bodies are dumped in mass graves. And then, silence. For decades, Tulsa buried this story. Schools didn't teach it. Newspapers didn't mention it. Insurance companies refused to pay. It was as if Black Wall Street never existed. But the survivors never forgot. They carried the trauma, they told their children, and a century later, their story finally exploded into the national consciousness. This is the Tulsa Race Massacre. This is how America's Black Wall Street burned. This is how wealth, dreams, and lives were stolen in a single night. And this is why it matters more than ever. To understand the massacre, you must first understand what was destroyed. The Greenwood district wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a miracle. In 1906, O.W. Gurley, a wealthy black landowner, purchased 40 acres in North Tulsa. He sold lots exclusively to black buyers. What grew from that plot of land would become legendary.
By 1921, Greenwood had over 10,000 black residents. It had 2 newspapers, 2 theaters, a hospital, a bus system, 13 churches, over 300 black-owned businesses. There were hotels, restaurants, grocery stores, law offices, medical practices. Greenwood Avenue, the main street, was paved with success. Black doctors lived in mansions. Black children went to well-funded schools. This is why it was called Black Wall Street. Here's what made Greenwood extraordinary. The dollar circulated. When a black resident earned money, they spent it at black-owned businesses. That business owner paid black employees, who spent at other black businesses. Economists call it the black dollar circulation. Money stayed in the community, sometimes circulating 36 to 100 times before leaving. This created generational wealth. This created power. But across the railroad tracks, white Tulsa was watching, and they were furious. How dare these people, whose parents and grandparents had been enslaved, live better than poor whites? How dare they own luxury cars, fine homes, successful businesses? The Tulsa Tribune wrote articles complaining about uppity Negroes. White businessmen resented the competition. And Oklahoma, like much of America in 1921, was drowning in white supremacist ideology. This was the era of the Red Summer of 1919, when white mobs attacked black communities across America. The Ku Klux Klan was resurgent, with millions of members nationwide. Lynchings were common. 3,400 black Americans were lynched between 1882 and 1968. And in Tulsa, the Klan had infiltrated the police department, city government, and business leadership. Greenwood's success wasn't celebrated, it was seen as a threat. The residents of Greenwood knew the danger. They knew that white resentment simmered, but they believed their success, their respectability, their wealth would protect them. They were wrong. Because on May 30th, 1921, a young black man would step into an elevator with a white woman, and everything they built would burn. Dick Rowland was 19 years old. He worked as a shoe shiner in downtown Tulsa. He was well-liked, friendly, ambitious. On May 30th, 1921, Memorial Day, he needed to use the restroom. The only one available to black workers was on the top floor of the Drexel building. To get there, he had to take the elevator. The elevator operator was Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white woman. What happened in that elevator? No one knows for certain. The most likely story, based on witness accounts, is that Dick Rowland tripped entering the elevator and grabbed Sarah Page's arm to steady himself. She screamed, he ran, terrified. Another version suggests they knew each other, possibly were even romantically involved, and someone saw them together. Either way, Sarah Page screamed. And that scream would doom Greenwood. By the next morning, May 31st, the Tulsa Tribune ran a story with the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." The article claimed Dick Rowland had assaulted Sarah Page. It was sensational, it was inflammatory, and parts of it were likely fabricated. Some survivors recall the Tribune ran an editorial titled, "To Lynch Negro Tonight," though no copies survive. Whether that specific headline existed or not, the message was clear. A black man had violated a white woman, and in 1921 Oklahoma, that meant one thing: lynching. Dick Rowland was arrested and taken to the Tulsa County Courthouse, where he was held on the top floor. By late afternoon, word spread through white Tulsa: there's going to be a lynching tonight. A white mob began to gather outside the courthouse. Hundreds, then thousands. They demanded the sheriff turn over Dick Rowland. Sheriff Willard McCullough refused. He barricaded the top floor and armed his deputies. The mob grew larger, angrier. In Greenwood, word also spread. Black veterans, men who had just fought in World War I, knew exactly what was about to happen. They had seen lynchings. They knew Dick Rowland wouldn't survive the night if the mob got him. So they made a decision. Around 9 p.m., approximately 25 armed black men arrived at the courthouse. They offered to help the sheriff defend Dick Rowland. The sheriff said no. Go home. Reluctantly, they left. But an hour later, they returned. This time, 75 strong. And this time, someone fired a shot.
No one knows who fired first, but that shot ignited an inferno. The gunfight at the courthouse lasted minutes. When it ended, 10 whites and 2 blacks lay dead. The black defenders retreated to Greenwood, hoping the violence was over. It wasn't. It was just beginning. The white mob, now thousands strong, didn't disperse. Instead, they turned their rage toward one target: Greenwood. They were coming to burn Black Wall Street to the ground. By midnight, white mobs were gathering at the edge of Greenwood. They broke into hardware stores and pawn shops, stealing guns and ammunition. They set up machine gun nests. And then, around 1 a.m. on June 1st, they invaded. Not soldiers, not police stopping a riot. This was a white mob, aided by law enforcement, attacking a black neighborhood with military precision. They moved block by block, house by house. They shot black residents on sight. They dragged families from their homes. They looted everything of value: pianos, jewelry, furniture, cash, and then set the homes ablaze. Women were assaulted. Children were killed. Elderly residents were beaten. This wasn't a riot. This was a massacre. This was ethnic cleansing. And then came the planes. Yes, airplanes. Private planes, some piloted by off-duty police officers, flew over Greenwood and dropped incendiary devices: turpentine-soaked rags, dynamite, firebombs onto rooftops. Witnesses described the planes diving low and firing rifles into crowds. This may be the first aerial bombing of an American city, and it was aimed at American citizens, black citizens, by their own neighbors. Survivors told harrowing stories. Families hid in attics while their homes burned beneath them. Mothers covered their children's mouths to keep them silent. People ran to the Frisco railroad tracks seeking escape, only to be shot down. Some fled into the woods and stayed hidden for days.
One survivor, Olivia Hooker, just 6 years old at the time, watched through a crack in the floorboards as white men stomped her family's possessions to pieces. She remembered their boots, their laughter. By dawn on June 1st, Greenwood was unrecognizable. Entire blocks were reduced to smoking ruins. Bodies lay in the streets. The National Guard finally arrived, but not to protect black residents. They came to round them up. Black survivors were marched at gunpoint to detention centers, a baseball stadium, the fairgrounds, where they were imprisoned. To be released, they needed a white person to vouch for them, to verify they were good Negroes.
Aftermath sets in. By noon on June 1st, the violence was over, but the destruction was complete. 35 square blocks gone. 1,256 homes burned. 300 to 3,000 black residents dead. The exact death toll remains unknown because bodies were buried in mass graves, dumped in the Arkansas River, or secretly buried by families. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, citing riot exclusions. And the official story? A race riot caused by armed Negroes. Tulsa blamed the victims. In the days after the massacre, Tulsa's white leadership moved quickly, not to prosecute the attackers, but to bury the story. Grand jury investigations were held. The conclusion? Black residents were at fault for defending Dick Rowland. 0 white participants were ever convicted. 0. Meanwhile, dozens of black survivors were charged with inciting a riot for defending their own neighborhood.
Rebuilding sabotage. White city officials proposed a plan to rebuild Greenwood as an industrial zone. They wanted to seize the burned land through eminent domain and prevent black families from returning. They offered no compensation. The residents of Greenwood refused. They rebuilt themselves with their own money, their own labor, their own defiance. But the wealth was gone. The businesses were gone, and the trauma would last generations. Then came the silence. Tulsa newspapers stopped reporting on the massacre. Textbooks didn't mention it. White residents pretended it never happened. Even many black families stopped talking about it. The trauma was too deep, the fear too real. By the 1960s, young people in Tulsa, black and white, had no idea a massacre had occurred in their city. It was the most successful cover-up of a mass atrocity in American history. And what happened to the people at the center of it all? Dick Rowland was released from jail. The charges quietly dropped. He left Tulsa immediately and was never heard from again. Sarah Page also disappeared. She refused to cooperate with prosecutors. Some historians believe she knew the assault allegation was false, or that she and Dick Rowland had a consensual relationship. Either way, she vanished from history, and Tulsa was relieved. No trial meant no attention. No attention meant the story could die. But the survivors carried the truth. Families passed down stories in whispers. Elderly survivors lived with nightmares for decades. They lost everything, but were told to be grateful they survived. They were told to forget, to move on, to not make trouble. And for 50 years, most of America never knew that Black Wall Street had even existed, let alone that it was destroyed by a white mob in one of the worst incidents of racial violence in U.S. history. The first crack in the silence came in 1971, 50 years after the massacre, when a Tulsa Tribune reporter named Ed Wheeler wrote a series of articles titled "A Profile of a Race Riot." It was the first time many Tulsans learned their city's darkest secret. Then, in 1997, the Oklahoma legislature commissioned the Tulsa Race Riot Commission to investigate. Survivors testified, mass grave sites were identified, and the truth, long buried, began to surface. Survivors like Olivia Hooker, George Monroe, Wilhelmina Des Howell, and Leslie Benningfield Randall, many in their 90s and 100s, finally told their stories publicly. They described the terror, the loss, the injustice. Leslie Randall, who was 6 years old during the massacre, recalled hiding under a table while white men burned her home. She said, "I felt like I wasn't a human being. They treated us like animals." In 2001, the commission released its final report. It confirmed this was not a riot. It was a massacre. The death toll was likely 100 to 300. Survivors deserved reparations, but reparations were never paid. In 2020, sparked by nationwide protests after George Floyd's murder, the Tulsa Massacre exploded into the national consciousness. HBO's Watchmen featured it, LeBron James tweeted about it, schools began teaching it, and America asked, "How did we not know?"
In 2021 and 2022, excavations began at suspected mass grave sites. In October 2021, exactly 100 years after the massacre, researchers uncovered remains at Oaklawn Cemetery. At least 12 bodies, potentially dozens more. Gunshot wounds were found in some remains. These were victims of the massacre, buried in unmarked graves, forgotten for a century. Their families still don't know their names. The fight for recognition continues. Today, only 3 known survivors remain. Leslie Benningfield Randall, 109 years old, Viola Fletcher, 110, and Hughes Van Ellis, 102. They have spent their final years fighting for justice. In 2021, they filed a lawsuit demanding reparations. As of 2024, they are still fighting. And Tulsa, once silent, can no longer ignore what happened. The truth is out, but justice is still delayed. The Tulsa Race Massacre wasn't just about lives lost, it was about wealth stolen. Economists estimate that $30 million in black wealth was destroyed in 1921. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $400 million today. But the real cost is incalculable, because wealth compounds. If those homes, businesses, and properties had remained in black families, they would have generated generational wealth for a century. Generational impact. Imagine if your great-grandparents owned a thriving business in 1921. They planned to pass it to your grandparents, who would pass it to your parents, who would pass it to you. That's generational wealth. That's how families build stability. But for the descendants of Greenwood, that wealth vanished overnight. Their inheritances were ashes, and the racial wealth gap in America, already enormous, grew wider. No compensation. Insurance companies refused to pay out claims, citing riot clauses in policies that excluded civil unrest. Survivors sued. They lost. The federal government offered no disaster relief, no reparations, nothing. Families who had built mansions, businesses, and savings were left with nothing. And white Tulsans, many of them profited, looting valuables, seizing land, benefiting from reduced black competition. Broader implications. This pattern repeated across America. Rosewood, Florida in 1923. The destruction of thriving black neighborhoods for highway construction in the 1950s and 60s. Redlining that prevented black families from building wealth through home ownership. The Tulsa Massacre is not an isolated incident. It's part of a systemic campaign to prevent black Americans from accumulating wealth, and its effects are still felt today. Lesson 1. Respectability politics don't protect you. The residents of Greenwood did everything right. They built businesses. They educated their children. They were prosperous, law-abiding, upstanding citizens. And it didn't matter. When a white mob decided they were a threat, all their success was used against them. They're getting too uppity, too wealthy, too powerful. Success made them targets. Lesson 2. Lies have consequences.
Lesson 2. Lies kill. Whether Sarah Page was assaulted or not, the Tulsa Tribune chose to publish a sensational, inflammatory story without verification. That story whipped white Tulsa into a frenzy, and 300 people died. Misinformation isn't harmless. When media weaponizes fear, people die. And in 1921, there was no correction, no apology, no accountability. Lesson 3. Silence is erasure. For 50 years, Tulsa buried this story. Teachers didn't teach it, historians didn't write about it, newspapers didn't mention it, and generations grew up not knowing. That silence wasn't accidental, it was intentional. Because if you can erase a crime from history, you never have to answer for it. But the survivors never forgot, and their voices, eventually, could not be silenced. Lesson 4. Justice delayed is justice denied. It's been over 100 years. The last 3 survivors are over 100 years old. They have spent their entire lives waiting for acknowledgement, for apology, for reparations. And they're still waiting. When a crime takes a century to be recognized and another century to be addressed, is that justice? Or is it just waiting for the victims to die so you don't have to pay? Lesson 5. This can happen again. In 1921, Tulsa was a modern American city. Airplanes, cars, telephones, newspapers. This wasn't some lawless frontier. And yet, thousands of ordinary citizens, neighbors, police officers, business owners participated in a massacre. They believed they were justified. And history has shown, when people are dehumanized, when media stokes fear, when authorities enable violence, it can happen anywhere, even here, even now. Let us remember them, not as statistics, not as victims, but as human beings. Olivia Hooker, who became one of the first black women in the U.S. Coast Guard. George Monroe, who watched his father gunned down and carried that trauma for 99 years. Wilhelmina Guess Howell, who testified before Congress in her 90s, demanding justice. And the 3 who remain today. Viola Fletcher, 110 years old, who was 7 during the massacre. She said, "I am 110 years old and have never seen justice. I pray that one day I will." Hughes Van Ellis, 102, who was an infant when his family fled Greenwood. And Leslie Benningfield Randall, 109, who lost her home, her childhood, her sense of safety. They are still fighting. These survivors didn't just lose property. They lost childhoods. They lost the ability to feel safe in their own country. They lost the wealth their parents built. They lost the America they thought they lived in. And for most of their lives, they weren't even allowed to talk about it. Imagine carrying that for 100 years. Imagine being told to forget, to move on, to be grateful you survived. But they didn't forget. They testified. They demanded to be heard. And because of them, the truth is now undeniable. Black Wall Street existed. It thrived. And it was destroyed by white supremacist violence aided by government officials. That is historical fact. And it's fact because survivors like Viola Fletcher refused to let America forget. The question is, will we listen? Will we act? Or will we let them die waiting for justice, just like America has done to so many others?
The word reparations makes many people uncomfortable. That was 100 years ago, they say. I didn't do it. Why should I pay? But reparations aren't about punishing descendants of perpetrators. They're about repairing harm. When a crime steals generational wealth, the harm doesn't end when the victim dies. It compounds. It echoes through generations, and so must the repair. What reparations could look like? Reparations for Tulsa survivors could include direct payments to the 3 living survivors and verified descendants, funding for education about the massacre in Tulsa schools, economic investment in North Tulsa, which remains economically depressed today, scholarship funds for descendants, free health care for survivors and descendants, a national memorial. These aren't radical ideas, they're basic justice. Broader implications. But the fight for Tulsa reparations is about more than Tulsa. It's a test case. If America can't provide justice for a massacre this well documented, this recent, with survivors still alive, then what hope is there for reparations for slavery, for Jim Crow, for redlining? The Tulsa survivors are 100+ years old. If we wait any longer, we'll be paying reparations to graves. Is that the America we want to be? Acknowledgement is not enough. Acknowledgement is progress. Teaching the truth is progress, but it's not justice. Justice requires repair. It requires compensation. It requires saying, this was wrong, you were harmed, and we will make it right. Anything less is just waiting for the problem to die. So the question isn't, can we afford reparations? The question is, can we afford not to? Because every day we delay, we tell survivors, your suffering doesn't matter, your loss doesn't count, and that message echoes far beyond Tulsa. If you've watched this far, you now know a story that millions of Americans still don't. You know that in 1921, a thriving black community was burned to the ground by a white mob. You know that over 300 people died. You know that $30 million in black wealth was stolen. And you know that 100 years later, survivors are still waiting for justice. So what do you do with this knowledge? Do you share it? Do you teach it to your children? Do you support the survivors' lawsuit? Do you demand that your representatives act? Or do you let this video end and move on, just like Tulsa did for 50 years? History isn't just about the past, it's about what we choose to do with the truth once we know it.
But here's what I want you to remember. Black Wall Street wasn't destroyed. It was burned. And there's a difference. Because the people who built it, they rebuilt. The spirit that created Greenwood, the entrepreneurship, the pride, the refusal to accept second-class citizenship, that spirit didn't die in the ashes. It lives in every Black-owned business today. Every Black family building generational wealth, every Black community thriving despite systemic barriers. They tried to burn Black Wall Street, but they couldn't burn the dream. The Tulsa Race Massacre is a test of whether America can face its past honestly, a test of whether we believe in justice or just in waiting out the clock, a test of whether Black lives, Black wealth, and Black communities matter as much as white comfort. 103 years later, 3 survivors are still waiting for the answer. What will we tell them? Remember Tulsa. Remember Black Wall Street. Honor the survivors, demand justice, and never, ever forget what was stolen. Thank you for watching. Share this story. It deserves to be told.